and welcome along to the Black Theology Forum here at Queen's. My name is Dulcie Dixon McKenzie, and I'm the Director for the Centre of Black Theology, and we are here to bring you our monthly forum where we have a critical conversation, all things theological. And I'm delighted this evening that our special guest is Professor Allan Boesak, who is a South African pastor and theologian, though you might know him more for his work as an anti-apartheid activist, if you like. So we are here this evening to enjoy what he has to say to us by way of a presentation. This evening will be in two parts. We will hear from Professor Allan first of all, and he will share with us some thoughts that are on his mind, linked to this title, Theology on the Frontlines, Fighting Pandemics, Rediscovering Resilience, Rekindling Vitality. Once we've heard from Professor Allan, we will then take your questions, and we're going to invite you to keep those questions coming through by way of letting us know what's on your mind by way of a chat in the facility there. And when we've had our Q&A, we'll have a break, and then we'll talk to 4 of our students. Here at Queen's, we have now some 5 cohorts of students, coming up to 70 students here. And this evening, we're going to be hearing from 4 of our postgraduate students who will be sharing thoughts on their mind. They'll be sharing questions related to their area of research, and they're going to be listening very keenly to what Professor Allan has to say this evening in order to engage with him by way of some questions. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Professor Allan to come and speak with us. And there is such a long CV that we could mention here this evening, but I won't do that. We'll save some time and we'll come back to his bio later on. But without further ado, Professor Allan Boesak, if you would join us this evening to share with us what's on your mind in relation to theology on the front lines, fighting pandemics, rediscovering resilience, and rekindling vitality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. McKenzie. I am very grateful for this invitation to share with you and that vast audience of students that you have for us tonight. It's a great pleasure to be with you. So let us begin with Latin American liberation theologian John Sobrino. The first task of Christian liberation theology, he writes, is to try to attempt honesty toward reality. It is a very difficult task, he says, because our world is characterized by institutions, systems of injustice and violence. Even more, our world is also characterized by systems of concealment of injustice and violence. And this makes it extremely difficult for us to be honest about our reality. I agree. Why? Because the forces of imperialism, coloniality, racism, white supremacy, heteronormative oppression, and enslavement benefit from both the violence and the injustices as well as the concealment thereof. For this reason, Black theology is, for Steve Biko, quote, a theology that seeks a fighting God who will not let the lie in challenge. End of quote. No hesitations, no equivocations, no prevarications, no compromises with a white, blue-eyed, sweet and gentle Jesus whose innocent blood saves our souls, but who cannot save us from white oppressors whose hands are dripping with the blood of the innocent. James Cone speaks of the Black theologian as an exegete of scripture and of life. Reading scripture without knowing its meaning for the life and real lived experiences and faith of the oppressed is meaningless. And for that reason, I titled my dissertation, Farewell to Innocence. All of us understood that living in a hostile, white-controlled world, Black people cannot afford to ignore the realities of a deliberately designed, insidious, persistent series of pandemics brought on by a history of imperialism, colonialism, enslavement, genocide, epistemicide, land theft, oppression, economic exploitation, and dehumanization. It is what Frantz Fanon called a virtual apocalypse. Black theology insisted that whites should not be able to claim innocence of this history and their agency in it, and that Black people should not be allowed to feign innocence while the struggle for freedom, dignity, and life was going on. And that is why studies such as that of Dr. Joy DeGreen on post-traumatic slave syndrome, studying the aftermath of histories of slavery and its intergenerational impact on Blacks today, are so crucial. We are so insistent on this because Martinique's Aimé Césaire was correct when he spoke of, quote, the singularity of Blackness. Right from the outset, Black theology, as other expressions of liberation theology, feminist theologies, womanist theology, and more recently queer theology, was defined and understood as a contextual theology. But unlike the claims of universality made by the dominant Eurocentric theologies, it grapples with the existential situations of Black oppressed people engaged in life and death struggles for liberation and justice, refusing to give up their faith in Jesus, their liberator Messiah. We embrace that Black experience in our struggle to embrace the scriptures and the significance of Jesus of Nazareth, not just for the human story in general, but for the story of Black humanity in confrontation with white Christian racist domination, exploitation, and oppression. So in essence, Black theology was trying to say what the Black Lives Matter movement has made into such a strong rallying cry: Black Lives Matter. We should, Césaire insists, grasp with our full consciousness not only the meaning and impact of what he calls the terrible misfortunes that belong to no one else, but also the responsibilities that cannot belong to anyone else. He means the responsibility to understand, analyze, and interpret, to rise up in resistance, to actively engage the historical, social, economic, psychological, and political consequences of these misfortunes in full commitment to the struggle for the sake of dignity, freedom, justice, and equity. However, this uniqueness, this peculiarity, is not to be confused with the uniqueness whites claimed for themselves as God's chosen people. It is a claim made equally eloquently and fervently by English-speaking imperialists and white Afrikaner Calvinists, reflected in the chauvinistic certitude of that tireless imperialist Cecil John Rhodes, who spoke of the British as, quote, God's ideal type, his own Anglo-Saxon race, unquote. Theirs was a peculiarity that demanded power and privilege at the expense of the humanity and right of existence of others. Neither is it the uniqueness that comes with unique rights appropriated in obliteration of the rights of others, the right to sacralized entitlement, to dominion and impunity. That in turn comes also with a unique and utterly deadly exceptionalism and innocence, such as we saw in white apartheid South Africa and currently still rampant in white nationalist imperialist America, and in equal lethal measure in the Zionist Israeli apartheid state. The peculiarity I have in mind, following Césaire, is the singularity of Blackness as a condition of oppression, exploitation, and subjugation, which, when the oppression is properly understood and oppressed people rise up to claim their dignity and freedom, is turned into a condition of resistance. It was not exclusivist, however. Whites who were ready to accept Black leadership, share Black aspirations, ready to share the risks of commitment, were invited to join the resistance, thereby taking upon themselves the condition of blackness, so that the condition of freedom and equality would finally become the condition of all. It is the peculiarity of Ubuntu, the constant and deliberate consciousness that my humanity is bound up in the humanity of the other, that my humanity is validated by the humanity of the other, that I can only be what I ought to be when the other is what they ought to be. And just as Black theology embraces the singularity of blackness, so Black theology embraces the singularity of gender and of Black womanhood in particular, the singularity of queerness, as well as the particularity of the Palestinian situation. A Black theology that understands the indivisibility of God's love and justice will welcome and learn from womanist and queer theologies in order to deepen the meaning of authentic singularity, embodied solidarity, and inclusive humanity. What singularity am I talking about? This singularity. Slavery was a form of cruelty and brutality we still struggle to give words to. And while brutality and slavery have always gone together, the particular kind of brutality inflicted on the Black enslaved, and particularly because of the racial element in it, was a kind of savagery unparalleled and incomparable, especially should the slaves dare to rebel in their search for freedom. In 1796, for instance, in Suriname, a country colonized, stolen by the Dutch, a common punishment for a rebel slave was to be hanged with an iron hook through his body, roasted over a fire, while being tortured with glowing tongues. And whereas in the Roman Empire, crucifixion was reserved for adult rebels, runaway slaves, and those like Jesus, considered a severe threat to the empire, white colonialist crucifixion started with our enslaved children as an example and deterrent to their parents and elders who might have been thinking of rebellion. Another example, South African womanist theologian Fundiswa Kobe tells of her reflections after visiting that infamous Elmina castle, the dungeon where the Dutch slave traders held their captives. I quote her. In Elmina, she says, one sees broken Black African women's bodies. The touch of the cracked walls brings the feeling of their scars, visible and invisible. One smells their odor in those dungeons as though they were never cleaned. The smell of urine, feces, and menstrual blood is still there because these women were not allowed to leave the dungeons even to relieve themselves. They had to relieve themselves right there where they were kept. The only time they were bathed is when one of them was chosen on a particular day to satisfy the enslaver's sexual fantasies. And even then, she would be bathed in public by water that was not used by the Dutch officials who feared that it had been poisoned by the Portuguese from whom they had inherited the castle. Our picture, she says, is that of seeing, feeling, and smelling women who on daily basis wondered when their turn would come down there in the congested dungeons, where their bodies and minds would be violated and their souls crushed before they would be taken through the door of no return, to be sailed across the Atlantic, never to return to their motherland. The transatlantic slavery, she concludes, system ensured that they were kept there, trained in dungeons, and indeed, the bodies of Black African women are disfigured and deformed in many ways even today, close quote. That is the singularity I'm talking about. One last example. One of the last and most horrific public lynchings in America took place in October of 1934 in the Florida Panhandle, where a crowd of as many as 5,000 gathered to watch what had been advertised hours earlier in the local press. Claude Neal was burned and castrated, had his genitals stuffed into his mouth, was forced to tell his torturers that he enjoyed their taste. After he was finally dragged to his death behind a car, his mutilated corpse was urinated upon by the crowds and then hung from the Mariana courthouse. End quote. That pandemic has still not stopped. In the United States, a Black or person of color is murdered by police or someone in uniform every 28 hours. And that we would do well to keep in mind the immortal warnings of Mother Mamie Till, the mother of 14-year-old Emmett Till, who was slaughtered in 1954. She says, "The murder of my child has shown me that what happens to any one of us anywhere in the world had better be the business of us all." On top of all of this, we need to cope with yet another pandemic, the novel coronavirus. And it presents us with multiple crises all at once. Important for us, though, in this discussion is to keep in mind that the coronavirus has itself destroyed the myth that the pandemic is the great equalizer. It has not only exposed the criminal inequalities in healthcare, it has exposed all the entrenched structural, institutional, and systemic economic, social, and political inequalities, and the incessant, comprehensive war against the poor and the vulnerable, globally and nationally. Whether we are talking about people of color in the United States, in the UK, in Europe, or of Native Americans in the US, Canada, Bolivia, Brazil, or Chile, the racial element in all of this nationally and globally is now undeniable. Experts warn that poverty, hunger, diseases, and violence exacerbated by the pandemic, including gender-based violence, may dwarf the number of those dying of the violence itself. All of the falsehoods and fallacies are now exposed. So for Black theology, the question always is, how do we fight this? And in this struggle, how do we rediscover our resilience, and how do we rekindle our vitality and retain it as a Black church, a community, and a Black people? Black theology is a theology from the underside of history, declared the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians in 1976. As such, in my view, it is not so much a theology from the margins as it is a theology of the marginalized. This is how I see it. Jesus was from the margins, and the people he liberated and healed, like the woman with a bleeding tissue or the Gerasene demoniac, were always taken from the margins and placed in the center, not just the center of attention, but of the liberating and empowering grace of God. And Jesus' resounding in remembrance of her, speaking of the unknown and unnamed sister from Bethany in Matthew 26, echoing in his remembrance of me, this time speaking of himself in Luke 24:19, is perhaps the most astonishing illustration of this. It is a ringing affirmation of the conviction of a 17th century African insurrectionist square leader, a Khoi leader, who insisted that the gospel does not belong to white people, even though they claimed sole ownership of it. Black theology is a theology of the marginalized, determined that the marginalized shall absolutely not remain on the margins forever, but stand in the center of God's revolutionary actions in the world. As a theology of liberation, nothing anchors Black theology more than the Exodus story and the message, life, and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. The Exodus, because it is the testimony of faith in a God who takes the side of the poor and the oppressed, the vanquished and the enslaved, the cast aside and the destitute, against the powerful and the privileged. Luke 4, verse 16 to 18 is also central to Black theology. But in terms of Luke, we should take notice of something important here. Jesus, Luke tells us, reads from the book of Isaiah. But not only does Jesus bring together two passages of serious judgment on injustice and the radical call for justice from two separate chapters in Isaiah, chapter 58 and chapter 61, Jesus goes further. In the verses that follow, Jesus departs from Isaiah. Jesus radicalizes those passages and speaks of God's love, grace, mercy, and justice, not just to Israel, but for other nations as well. He intentionally breaks down the walls of racial separation. He rejects the ideologies of nationalist exclusion and overturns the teachings of religious favoritism. And it is then that those listening to him become so outraged that they wanted to throw him off a cliff. What Jesus does is he is engaging and enacting God's radical, indivisible justice, God's radical, indivisible equality, and God's radical, indivisible inclusivity. To me, that is crucial for Black theology to understand. The stream of prophetic faithfulness, prophetic courage, prophetic truthfulness, and prophetic resistance that runs right through the Bible originates in the courage of the midwives standing up against the Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 2, and in Miriam standing her ground on the riverbank, the seashore, and in the wilderness, where she offers an entirely different form of prophetic presence than does Moses. It runs through the testimony of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 2, the stance of the 8th century prophets and of John the Baptist, and culminates in Jesus of Nazareth, who personified God's preferential option for the poor and invariably took sides against the powerful and for the suffering and oppressed. It is this message of liberation, freedom, dignity, and equality that Black people have intuitively embraced throughout the ages, over against the appropriation of the gospel by oppressors and slave owners. And it is that faith that sustained Black people in their faith and in their struggles for justice and freedom. In the rediscovery of that resilience and the rekindling of that vitality lies the survival, the liberation, and the future of the Black church. Now let me say something about the roots of Black theology. In many ways, it is a blessing that modern Black theology in South Africa did not emerge within the structures of academia. In the United States, James Hal Cone, the father of modern Black theology, wrote his Black Theology and Black Power as an indisputably academic work. Yet, Cone himself testifies that this work was the culmination of the thinking of a fairly small group of Black, radical, theological thinkers who emerged from the civil rights movement, in other words, activist theologians from outside the academy, but from within the Black church and the Black community. I make the distinction between Black theology movement of the late 1960s onward, starting with the work of James Cone, and the early beginnings of Black theology, as expressed, for example, in the writings and the preaching of the Christian leaders of the 18th and 19th century slave revolts, such as Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner in the United States, and the African rebel leaders Jan Parel and Kibulu Kakarlak in South Africa, as well as their compatriot, the blind poet and composer John Nsikana. Without doubt, the earliest expressions of Black liberation theology historically came into being within context of roiling revolutionary resistance. Dona Kimpa Vita from the Congo was burned at the stake by the Portuguese as a revolutionary resistor to colonialist oppression and the imperialist appropriation of the Christian faith by the Roman Catholic Church on July 2, 1706. It is she whose vision saw Jesus and his mother Mary as African, not as an icon for meditative or syncretistic missionary purposes, but inspiring her resistance to the foreign powers occupying her country. Hers was, as far as we know, the first explicit Black theology as an African expression of Black revolutionary resistance to imperialism. No wonder that the present generation of young African activists acknowledges this Christian young woman as, quote, the mother of African revolution. She died a martyr of a revolutionary African faith. And it was Bishop Henry McNeill Turner from the African Methodist Episcopal Church who visited South Africa in 1896 and stirred the embers of a militant Black theology of liberation in South Africa. It was that same Turner who first uttered the words, "God is a Negro," and it was words that would throw James Cone into a vortex of white fear, umbrage, and offended academic dignity when he dared to portray Jesus Christ as the Black Messiah in his work that caused such a turmoil in white-controlled academia. But birthed into and within the heat of struggles for justice and freedom and dignity, Black theology in South Africa could not but be indelibly shaped and molded and infused by those struggles. Being born into the literal flames of struggle in that decisive phase since the early 1970s, and baptized with fire, nurtured by the suffering and the joys of fighting for truth, justice, and freedom, endowed South African Black theology with a uniquely fashioned character. But it also brought with it a unique responsibility. From its inception, Black theology was therefore held accountable, not so much to the rules and expectations of formal white-controlled academia, but to the expectations and the sufferings, the hopes of the people. It is that connectivity with the struggles, hopes, and aspirations of the people that keep Black theology rooted in the resilience and vitality of the faith of the people. Like American Black theology, South African Black theology is, so to speak, one of a set of historic triplets: Black consciousness, Black theology, and Black power. The Dutch Reformed Mission Church, the church in which I was born into, was established in 1881 as an apartheid church, created especially for people designated as colored in South Africa's racialized pigmentocracy, the result of the white Dutch Reformed Church's racist, white supremacist, ideologized theology, the desire of the white colonizers of my country and my people to exert complete domination and full control over the colonized, not only in society, but also in church. So for 3/4 of a century, under control of white missionaries, my church did not utter one word of meaningful protest against colonization, imperialism, or apartheid. But our discovery of God as the God of liberation, of Jesus as the revolutionary Black Messiah from occupied Galilee, and of the Holy Spirit who transforms and empowers us as she moves amongst us to transform us, and she has changed all of that profoundly. Black consciousness, Black theology, Black power, and the Soweto Revolution from 1976 opened the door to that new understanding. We found our voice and we mounted serious and more intense resistance to the regime and the church that provided apartheid's biblical, moral, and theological justifications. So we identified and exposed the fundamental and indispensable ideological power matrix that necessitated first a hierarchical, heteronormative, racist separation in society of people, and then of the church, a church for the colonizer and a church for the colonized. Second, the creation of a theology designed to justify, sanctify, and deify imperialist power, to protect at all costs white privilege, white supremacy, white innocence, and white victimhood. Our white rulers created and taught a theology for civilized masters and slave owners, and a theology for savages and slaves, a theology for black heathen and a theology for white Christians, a theology of justification and a theology that canceled out a theology of justice, a theology of subjugation and enslavement that eliminated a theology of freedom, a theology of submission that rejected a theology of resistance, a theology of pietistic quietism that left no room for a theology of prophetic radical discipleship. And we should not forget the power of the theology of hymnology. In the church, we all too often are what we sing. We were given a hymnified theology of otherworldliness that denied our people the voice to sing of holy this worldliness. A kind of theology that made us sing longingly of the golden streets of the New Jerusalem while the white man was stealing our gold from underneath our soil, right beneath our feet here on earth. They offered us a theology of imposed childishness, but never a theology of dignified personhood. In destroying that slave theology and creating that other theology of liberation, we discovered our freedom, rediscovered our childhood of God, reinvigorated our faith, and in our case, claimed the radical Reformed tradition as our rightful heritage. Black theology is by its very nature an ecumenical theology. Denominationalism would play no role except where denominations were regarded as particular sites of struggle. Denominationalism was, as was apartheid's racial categorizing, seen as part of the divide and rule strategies of the ruling classes. What divided white South African Christians, and conversely, what united blacks and whites in Christ, however significant both might have been, was never significant enough to break the bonds of common white interests. So we now understand much better, despite its enormous impact on the history of the church and of the world, how little difference the Reformation fundamentally made to the real life situations of enslaved and oppressed peoples. Furthermore, one could not have black solidarity and the community of the black oppressed as black consciousness demanded in the political arena and have a denominationally splintered theological arena. And so it was the most natural thing in the world for me, a Reformed theologian, to work side by side with the Roman Catholic priest Mangaliso Mkatshwa, the Lutheran Manas Buthelezi, and the Pentecostal Frank Chikane. And as I worked together with Maulana Farid Esak of the Muslim faith. So there are increasing challenges for Black liberation theology as we step further into the 21st century. We should be aware, first of all, that we are living in an imperial world, more specifically, a world in the grip of the American empire. We define empire as a calculated coalescing of global forces, pooling their economic, political, military, and cultural resources together in unprecedented and frightening ways in an onslaught on the Black world and the world of poor and vulnerable people. American empire also represents itself as a new imperial religion, the religion that gave such unstinting, uncritical, and indispensable support to Donald Trump in his run for president, spurred on his racist, supremacist, misogynist, homophobic policies, sanctifies his warmongering, and baptized his fascism. That is the same white evangelical Christian religion that has gone to such extremes to recolonize our African societies, churches, and communities in the name of Jesus. The consequences of that conquest in Africa are devastating. I'm speaking of the waves of Christian new fundamentalism washing over Africa and much of the global South, with its toxic new colonialist package deal of scriptural selectivity, presented as biblical inerrancy, violent homophobia, patriarchal power, and anti-justice agenda. Its justification of war and violence in the name of Jesus, its religious exclusivism coupled with unbridled political ambition in its so-called dominion theology, and its prosperity gospel grounded in the embrace and enslavement to capitalist consumerist ideology. In its new colonialist alliances with capitalist power and the global media, it represents new realities for us. And prophetic theology should be much more aware and much better prepared to take on the challenges posed here. It certainly is dragging Africa, its churches, and its societies to the edge of a disaster every bit as devastating as colonialism. So to the question, how shall the Black church and Black theology respond to the situation? The answer must immediately be by turning to the sources of our vitality and rediscovering our resilience. There is a reason why the Black church in both our countries and in the United States has historically been our place of refuge, sustenance, and inspiration towards resistance. Of course, it must always begin with a reaffirmation, if it had not been for the Lord. And with a hymn, we've come thus far by faith, leaning on the Lord. And it is true, God has never failed us yet. More than a century ago, South Africa's Saul Plaatje put it in words as true now as they were then. The one thing that stands between us and despair is that heaven has not yet deserted us, he said. So we have survived and resisted 400 years and more of slavery and imperialism, colonialism, white supremacist, patriarchal, homophobic, capitalist tyranny. For centuries, the Bible was used as a battering ram of white racist superiority and domination, an infallible source not of the glory and justice of a holy God, but of white supremacy and Black subjection. Yet, Black Christians did not throw the Bible into the heart of the sea. We instead wrested it from the hands of the Pharaoh, and with also their power to read and interpret it for us, and found in it its most authentic and enduring message, namely that God is the God of the poor and the oppressed, the liberator of the captives, the healer of the brokenhearted, the defender of the widow and the orphan. This is the faith that made us not just survive, but rise up against oppression, and produced our prophets, Sojourner Truth and Henry McNeil Turner and Martin Luther King in the United States, Samuel Sharp in Jamaica, Sophia de Bruyn and Steve Biko in South Africa, just to name a few. That prophetic tradition is a source of our resilience. Furthermore, we must reclaim the ability and the necessity to speak truth to ourselves so that we will be able to speak truth to power. And that is another source of our vitality and our resilience. So we must ask the hard questions of the Black church and of Black theology. Are we still that prophetic church that offered guidance, sustenance, and hope to our people in times of trouble and in our struggles for freedom? Does South African Black theology remain weakened by its lack of inclusive solidarity and its bonds to the African National Congress loyalties? Is Black theology in the United States still too narrowly focused on race, not seeing class and the evils of new liberal capitalism, too USA focused to see the evils of American imperialism. Is our theology still a theology of liberation towards the wholeness of humanity? Or have we become the enablers, the aiders, and abettors of the re-enslavement of our people to the ideologies of new liberal consumerist capitalism, of baptized bigotry and sanctified imperialism? I have indicated before that one of the greatest signs of hope in the midst of all these crises is the global revolution for freedom, dignity, and life led by the Black Lives Matter movement. Can we discern God at work in that revolution, where it moves towards greater human solidarity, greater justice, greater inclusion, and the creation of a new humanity? Can we join that revolution, not as a Christianizing, pacifying agent, but as a sacrificial partisan of justice? We must reclaim anew for ourselves the stubborn, very first confession of the Christian church, the Lordship of Jesus Christ. That Lordship that is supreme servanthood and that inspires us to sacrificial deeds of love gives us courage beyond human imagination. It is a belief that countless South Africans, Blacks like myself, took with us into the streets of protest and confrontation, into the prison cells and torture chambers, into the face of death. Jesus is Lord. And we are once again facing a time that Frederick Douglass and his generation faced, and we must be honest about it. He said, at a time such as this, it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. So, in conclusion, no matter what happens, Jesus Christ is Lord. Come mockery and revilement and disdain and shame, come trial, come tribulation, come imprisonment and torture, come threat and intimidation and death. This is true. Jesus is Lord. In that confession is all the truth to make us free, all the wisdom to keep us humble, all the faith to know the way, all the hope to give us courage, all the strength to make us love, all the joy to keep us human. And if Black theology understands that, it will remain a theology of liberation and bring back the vitality and the resourcefulness and the resilience that we need. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Allan. Thank you so much for sharing quite a few things there that I'm inviting everyone now to start thinking about your questions and send them through chat. And I think I'd like us to start the Q&A, if you like, the question section of the evening with yourself, where perhaps we could have started in terms of your introduction, because you have been in ministry for some 52 years, Allan. And in that time, you went to prison. And it's something you said just towards the end, where when you talked about Jesus is Lord, the Lordship of Jesus is supreme servanthood. And then you go on to say that to go into prison and onto the streets, protesting and confronting and going into prison cells and torture chambers, facing death. Despite that, Jesus is Lord. And I don't think there's many of us in this room that can say that we've faced prison because of our faith. I wonder if you could just help us to understand that Jesus is Lord element that gave you such, shall we say, power, such strength in the face of adversity and white supremacy.
Yes, thank you for that question. I have discovered in our many years of struggle, not just me, but all of those, especially those young people. Remember, I was in those years, since the late 1970s, chaplain at a university and two other educational institutions. And those students were both at the heart of the struggle and in the front lines of the struggle. And every Sunday night, we would come together in the chapel and we would pray and worship, and I would preach. And during the week, we would do Bible study. And the students had discovered how utterly important their faith was for them. It's one thing to go into a struggle with a slogan. We're fighting for freedom. We're fighting for democracy. And that's not a lie. But those slogans may give you some direction. It may tell you what the political goals of the struggle might be, the ideals that you fight for. But what is it really when you are 15 and 16 and 17 years old that make you give up your own aspirations for yourself, that make you jeopardize your own chances for education and readiness for life as an educated person? What is it that makes you get up in the morning, go to some demonstration or a protest, knowing that you are facing the police and the army of the mightiest military force on the continent, that you are facing a people so powerful, not just because of themselves, but because at that time they had the solidarity of the whole white Western world behind them? What makes you go out and take all those risks, knowing that I might go to jail today, I might be shot today, I might die today, I might go to prison, I might be tortured? And yet, if you survive all of that, the next time there is a protest, you are there again. After the funeral of the young person shot next to you, you go back onto the street. Now, an ideal like democracy cannot give you that faith and that hope and that resilience and that courage. It's only when you know these people who call themselves so powerful, who can do whatever they like. To me, their power in the end is only an illusion, because the power above all of that is the power that empowers us. And that is why we say to P.W. Botha, when he was that president that really went to town on us in those days, we could say to them, you can do whatever you like. We know Jesus is Lord. And in the loneliness of your prison cell, and when you are in solitary confinement, when they sent me to prison and they put me in solitary confinement, they took away everything. I wasn't allowed to hear the radio. I wasn't allowed to see a newspaper. I wasn't allowed any books to read. I was alone on the whole floor, so I couldn't even speak or hear other prisoners as they talk. I could sometimes hear them sing, but I couldn't exchange anything. I was totally on my own. They thought that they were punishing me to take away the newspapers, and I was thinking, my goodness, I don't miss anything. I always thought South African newspapers in those days, and maybe even now, lied about everything. The only thing that they could not lie about was the date. But they gave me my Bible, or a Bible. And I thought, if I were you silly people, I would take away all of those, and I would also never give me a Bible, because I can do without all those books, but I wouldn't be able to do without my Bible. And that is the kind of power in your powerlessness that you have when you believe in the Lordship of Christ. And other people might find their inspiration elsewhere, but for me, in those most difficult times, that was what kept us alive, and that was what kept all those young people coming back to the streets. And they fought, and they fought, and they won in the end.
We've got some great questions coming in. Just before we go to them, I want to just pick up one other thing you mentioned and to ask you, what is prophetic theology? It links to very much what you've said a moment ago. So can you just outline it a bit more for us? What is prophetic theology?
Prophetic theology is that theology that has discovered in the Bible, amongst all those stories, that claims God to be on the side of the oppressor, that claims God to be on the side of a marauding, warmongering group of people who think that in the name of God they can claim other people's land and live off conquest and war. Amongst all of those stories that pushes women aside and make as if they don't exist, you find the story about a God whose heart turns over in anguish when God sees the plight of enslaved people, of oppressed people, of marginalized people, of excluded people. Prophetic theology discovers that that is the prophetic strain, as I say in the paper, and it begins right in the beginning of Israel's confession of God, and that is when those two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, have the courage to say to the most powerful king of the most powerful empire of that time, we are not going to do what you say. And so their resistance, which is inherited by Miriam and inherited by Hannah and inherited by the prophets of the 8th century, Jeremiah and Amos and Micah and so forth. And that is the prophetic strain, and that is picked up in the New Testament by Mary in the Magnificat, and by John the Baptist, and then by Jesus finally, and then taken up by those Christians who follow Jesus in the community of Jesus. And we take that strain as the strain that reveals to us not just the word of God, but the heart of God. And if you stand in that tradition, then you gain the power to challenge the powers that be. You speak truth to that power. You also have the courage to speak truth to yourself. And you understand that the world as it is cannot allow to be left as it is. It has to be changed. It has to be transformed until it conforms to the norms of the reign of God, which is justice and equality and mercy and love and solidarity and so forth and so on. That is prophetic theology for me.
Thank you, Allan. We have a series of questions coming in now and some comments as well. On that point of prophetic, we've got a question here. What's the difference between prophetic and liberation? I think this person means theology. Are they sisters?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. Prophetic theology is always a liberation theology. As I say, prophetic theology is prophetic theology because it stands on the message of liberation that we find running right through the Bible, beginning with the women there and ending in Jesus of Nazareth.
Thank you. Here's a quicker question that came quite early on when you were just talking to us, sharing your thoughts. Someone was saying here, you mentioned at the start, Black liberation and heteronormativity alongside queer liberation. Can you please briefly explain the link or connection?
Well, if you talk about liberation, and this is what we have learned, we didn't know it in the beginning. And that was one of the flaws of Black liberation theology. Black liberation theology from the very beginning was a theology of liberation, but it was not a complete theology of liberation, because we spoke as if the males could also speak for the experiences of women. We spoke as if the males could be the spokesperson on behalf of women. We spoke as if we talk about liberation that we drive, that we were the leaders of, you could ignore the women because we would then say, oh, but you know that you are included, but not really. So that's the heteronormative instincts that we had. And it took us a while, and it took the women a while to really critically engage with us and ask us, how can you talk about the liberation of our people if 50% and more of our people, namely the female part of our people, are simply left on the margins and on the sidelines as if they did not matter? And that's, I mean, when the women say to us, we hold up half the sky, you got to think about what that means. So if they don't hold up the sky, it's all going to tumbling down upon your head. And so that's the heteronormative part. And we understood that we have to become partners, equal partners in solidarity and encourage and in everything with the women in order to make our liberation whole. Without the liberation of the women, our societies will not be liberated completely. And the same is true for the LGBTQI, the person, and queer theology and queer existence. We act as if LGBTQI people did not exist, as if their concerns did not matter, as if their pain did not matter, as if their suffering was not important to us. That is a huge disservice that we did to them, and an injustice, but also a disservice to us. And that is why you will see in the paper, and I say this every time I get the chance to any audience, we have to make this an article of faith that within Black Liberation Theology, that we believe in God and in God's indivisible, radical justice, God's indivisible, radical inclusivity, God's indivisible, radical solidarity, God's indivisible, radical equality. And if you understand God as that reality in our lives, driving our struggles for justice, then that inclusivity, that indivisibility cannot leave anybody out. But that is, again, I think we have to be honest and say Black theology was very slow in discovering that. And that was one of the main driving forces behind the last book that I published, Children of the Waters of Meribah, because I thought it is time for Black theology to look this thing squarely in the eye and be honest with ourselves so that we can become whole. And making room for the women to help us become whole.
In the second part of the evening, we're going to talk more about womanist theology and that very book, which is my favorite of yours. But it's nearly time for us to take a break, and there were quite a few questions coming in for you. But let me just jump to this one. How do you compare your experience in South Africa under apartheid with Bonhoeffer under Hitler?
Well, in many ways, of course, it is the same, because Bonhoeffer was not just struggling against Nazism, but he was struggling against the Nazification of the church. That's just one thing. The situation in South Africa was not just apartheid, but that we had the truth that the ideology, the political ideology and practice of apartheid as a political reality was actually the child or the spawn of the church's theology of separation and apartheid, born in their mission policy way back in 1857. And once you understand that unholy intertwinement of those two ideologies, then you can understand why we later on came to see this as the beginning of a heresy and actually a blasphemy and a travesty of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So in that sense, that whole relationship between church and nationalism, church and ideology, church and political reality for an evil end is the same. Also, but then Bonhoeffer, of course, had to join over against that Nazified, nationalized, ethnicized, racist church. He had to help create a confessing church. And for us, that became the prophetic church that became part of the struggle against apartheid. But of course, that was a war that was a different kind of war than the situation, the struggle that we were in. And so one has to keep those differences in mind. Although, and we might not have time to talk about this tonight, one of the fundamental questions for Bonhoeffer was, while the struggle of a small minority of Germans, of which he became part, against Hitler and the Nazis was going on, he had to make a choice, not just to join that struggle theoretically, theologically, by writing about it, but joining the struggle in reality. In other words, he had to ask himself the question, when the struggle in Germany against Nazism came to the conclusion that we have no other option but to try and kill Hitler, do I join that struggle, or do I then say, no, this is too far for me? He actually joined the plot to kill Hitler. And that question for us, do I join the struggle also in its violent military struggle against apartheid? Or do I say, for me, I never could do that. My commitment to nonviolent militancy was too strong. I always thought that the way of nonviolence was not just the way of Bonhoeffer and Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and Albert Luthuli. It was also the way of Jesus. And so I could never do that. But I could completely understand why Nelson Mandela's generation, after 50 years of nonviolent resistance, found themselves in a position where Mandela, as he said, we either had to go under and give in to subjection or fight. And they made that choice. In my generation, we made a different choice. And the outcome of our struggle was indeed a victory over apartheid. But that is not a judgment on that generation or that choice or on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It is a choice that we made, and we helped to create a circumstance in which that could in fact become a political reality.
Okay, Allan, I wonder if I can just ask you one more question before we take a quick break. And then when we come back, we'll take more of the questions coming from our audience, and we want to engage with our postgraduate students who are ready to go with some key questions to you. Earlier on in your paper, you talked about Black Liberation Theology, and you were quite critical of your own South African theologians and what they were doing and not doing. You were also critical of America. I think I heard you say that maybe they are too focused on the Americanism to the point or the expense of Black liberation theology. I don't know if you want to say more about that, but here we are in Britain, we are growing. You could say we're coming behind South Africa, coming behind America. We have our own issues, our own ways of talking about God and thinking. You didn't mention Britain. Is there anything you might want to say to us from what you see in relation to Black liberation theology?
Thank you for that question. The reason why I did not mention Britain is I have not seen or read enough of the Black theology that is produced in Britain. And these conversations that I'm having with you, I'm hoping will teach me even more. I have begun to read some of the Black theology that is coming from Britain. And of course, there is a uniqueness in the Black theology in the UK that you must not let go of. I mean, your connection with Africa is not directly with Africa, but via the Caribbean, for instance. And you got to ask those questions. What is the heritage that I have from my African Black ancestors and their struggle against slavery in the Caribbean? And that is the reason why I mentioned Sam Sharp. I looked him up because I thought there has to be some connection. If you do Black theology in Britain, and you don't even refer to that history of Christians against slavery, and all you know about the end of slavery is the contribution of white nonconformists like Wilberforce, and that's all you know, then you're not really a Black theologian. You're not doing Black theology. You are repeating Eurocentric views on whatever the situation might be. So for you, that connection and that legacy that you bring from the Caribbean must be part of your Black theological experience, number one. Number two, though, you cannot do Black theology only concentrating on those issues that you see in front of you in Britain. Those issues are very important. What is it that British society makes of the Black presence in Britain? What is it that the politics of Boris Johnson is doing to Black people, not in general, to Black people in Britain? Are those things that we pick up in the United States, the racializing of the response to COVID-19, for instance, in terms of healthcare, in terms of socioeconomic inequalities and injustices, in terms of the vaccine and who gets it first, and that kind of thing? Is that a question for Black people in Britain? And I think it is, because we now know, I mean, there's a reason why people in South Africa know the name Enoch Powell. And so there has to be fundamental questions for Black people and the Black church in Britain. Is the Black church in Britain a liberation-minded church? A Jesus of Nazareth, a Jesus of Galilee, the revolutionary terrorist from the townships, I call him here. For Black church in Britain, if Jesus is not that, what Jesus are you talking about? Which Jesus do you see in the Bible? Whose Jesus are you preaching to your people about? So those are not just British questions. Those are universal questions for Black people. It's the same questions we ask here. So the connectivity between the Black struggle in the United Kingdom and the United States and in South Africa has to be very, very clear. As the connectivity with other struggles for freedom, for instance, the Palestinians. You can't be a Black theologian of liberation in Britain if you do not have sleepless nights about the freedom and the dignity and the suffering of the Palestinian people. The connectivity between those struggles has to be part of what we are doing. And so I'm hoping that these conversations will be a gateway for us to begin to talk about what that means to be a Black church, to be a Black liberation theology.
Thank you, Allan. Let's take a break, I think, because you've said a lot to us, and we want to continue our engagement with you. And we'll do that with students, and we'll come back to some of the questions that are still coming in. So we'll take a break for now. Let's take it for 5 minutes, shall we? And then when we come back, we shall be meeting 4 of our students here at Queen's and continue with our conversation. Thank you.